He was not yet a philosopher when the ship went down. He was a merchant, standing on the docks at Piraeus in the aftermath of a wreck, watching what remained of his cargo drift in the water, bolts of Phoenician purple dye, the deep red violet that came from the crushed shells of sea snails along the Levantine coast, worth more by weight than almost anything else the Mediterranean carried. It was the kind of color that emperors wore, the kind of color that, floating loose from its bales and dispersing into the cold harbor water, leaves a bruise across the surface of the sea. He had brought it from Cyprus, from the trading city of Citium where he was born, and now it was gone, and the ship was gone, and what remained of his life as a merchant was the question of what to do next. That man was Zeno of Citium, and what he did next was walk into Athens. The year was somewhere around 300 BCE, though the precise date has not survived, which seems appropriate for a tradition that would come to hold that dates and years are, in the final accounting, among the least significant things the mind can attend to. What mattered was the walk, and what Athens offered to a man who had just lost everything he had been carrying across the water. The city was full of philosophers. It had been full of philosophers for a long time, and the tradition of sitting in public places and asking difficult questions in the hearing of anyone who passed was already well established by the time Zeno arrived. He found his way to a bookseller, and at the bookseller's stall he encountered Xenophon's Memorabilia, the account of Socrates and his conversations, and something in what he read held him in place. He asked the bookseller where he could find men who spoke like this. The bookseller pointed him toward Crates of Thebes. Crates was a cynic philosopher, a follower at some distance of Diogenes of Sinope, who had famously lived in a large ceramic jar in Athens, and told Alexander the Great to move out of his sunlight. The cynics held that virtue was the only genuine good, that material wealth and social status were not merely unreliable, but actively corrupting, and that the philosopher who freed himself from dependence on these things was the freest person alive. Crates owned almost nothing. He wore plain clothes. He walked through Athens with the calm, unhurried demeanor of a man who had already settled, to his own satisfaction, the question of what he needed, and found the answer to be very little. And into the modest house of this nearly possessionless philosopher, Zeno walked and sat down to learn. What he found there was a seed of something he would eventually carry much further. The cyclic insistence that virtue alone constitutes the good life, not virtue as one component among others, not virtue as a useful instrument toward happiness, but virtue as the whole substance of what it means to live well, became the root from which Zeno's own philosophy grew. He took it seriously. He sat with it for years, studying under Crates and then under other teachers, including Stilpo of Megara, who sharpened his sense of logic, and Polemon, who led the academy that Plato had founded, and who carried with him the great inheritance of that tradition. Zeno was a careful student and a careful thinker. He took from each teacher what seemed true and put the rest down, the way a man who has lost his cargo learns to carry only what he genuinely needs. What he was building, slowly, over years of walking and listening and arguing in the streets of Athens, was something the Cynics had not made, a system. The Cynics had a doctrine and a practice, but they had not built the philosophical scaffolding that would hold those principles in place against rigorous examination. They had no formal logic, no systematic account of how the mind comes to know what it claims to know, no worked-out picture of the physical cosmos and its underlying structure. Zeno wanted all of this. He wanted a philosophy that could answer the logician's questions, the natural philosopher's questions, the ethicist's questions, and that could answer all of them in a way that was coherent, that held together, that could be tested against an intelligent opponent and not simply dissolve. He spent years building it. By the time he began teaching, he had a structure that divided philosophy into three interlocking parts: logic, which governed how the mind moves from evidence to conclusion; physics, which described the nature and structure of the cosmos; and ethics, which asked how a rational being ought to live within that cosmos. These three were not separate subjects. They were, for Zeno, aspects of a single inquiry. What linked them was a concept without which Stoic thought cannot be understood, and to which, once understood, the mind returns the way the eye returns to a source of light in a dim room. The Stoics called it logos. The word itself was not new. It had been used by Heraclitus of Ephesus 5 centuries before Zeno's birth to name the rational principle he believed governed the constant flux of all things, the law beneath the fire and the river. But Zeno and the philosophers who followed him took this idea and built an entire cosmology from it. The Logos in Stoic thought is not a deity observing the cosmos from some external vantage point. It is not a mind floating above matter, issuing commands. It is something more intimate than that, and in some ways more strange, a rational, fire-like principle that pervades everything that exists, running through every stone and every breath and every human thought, holding the universe together from the inside, the way warmth holds a living body together from within. It is not easy to describe, and the Stoics themselves used several images for it, none of them quite sufficient alone. Think of it as the warmth distributed evenly through a body that is alive. The heat is not in one place. It is not separate from the flesh it moves through. It is the condition of the body's coherence, the reason its parts are parts of a whole rather than separate objects that happen to be adjacent. Or think of it as the rational structure that makes an argument hold, the logical necessity that if these premises are true, this conclusion cannot be avoided. The Logos is what makes the cosmos an ordered whole rather than a collection of unrelated events. It is the reason that what happens next is not arbitrary. Every event in the Stoic picture unfolds according to this rational principle, woven into the fabric of a universe that is not random and not indifferent, but ordered and purposeful all the way through, in every smallest movement of every smallest thing. Zeno's contemporaries found this idea arresting, and they found the man who proposed it arresting too. He was not, by the accounts that survive, a particularly striking physical presence. He was described as lean and dark-skinned, a Phoenician from Cyprus, which in Athens marked him immediately as foreign. He had a slight stoop and a manner that some found dry and others found precise. He did not perform the dramatic philosophical provocations of the cynics. He did not sleep outdoors or challenge powerful men in public to demonstrate his freedom from their approval. He taught. He walked and he talked as he walked, which was a common way of conducting philosophy in Athens, and the men who wanted to hear him walked alongside him, and over time, the conversations gathered into something that could be called a school. The place where he taught gave the school its name. The Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, was a colonnaded public walkway at the northern edge of the Athenian Agora, the great central public space of the city, where courts convened, merchants traded, and citizens conducted almost every kind of official and unofficial business. The Stoa was long and open-sided, its roof supported by columns, its back wall covered in large painted murals depicting scenes of Athenian military glory. The Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians had held against the Persians, the sack of Troy, the Athenians and Spartans fighting together at the Battle of Oenoe. These were not subtle decorations. They were vivid, large and public, and they gave the space a particular quality, the quality of a place where history was present, not as text but as image, as the visible record of events that had shaped the world these Athenians inhabited. Into this space, under these painted battles, Zeno brought philosophy. He did not take his students to a private garden, the way Plato had taught in the grove of Academe, or Epicurus would teach in the enclosure of his own house. He taught in the open air, in one of the most public spaces in Athens, at a time of day when merchants and advocates and craftsmen and idlers moved through the agora on their ordinary errands. Anyone who stopped could hear him. Anyone who wanted to ask a question could step close enough to ask it. This was not accidental. There was something in the choice of the open colonnade that expressed something central to what Zeno was doing, a philosophy built for people who had work to do, who moved through a world of practical demands and material uncertainties, who needed something that would hold in the middle of ordinary life rather than only in the sheltered quiet of a private retreat. The Stoics, from the beginning, were philosophers of the ordinary day. What Zeno was teaching in that colonnade, under the painted image of Marathon, was a picture of the good life that departed sharply from several of the most influential accounts available in Athens. The Platonists held that the highest human life was one of philosophical contemplation, turned toward the eternal forms that lay behind the visible world. The Aristotelians held that the good life required the exercise of intellectual and moral virtues, but also that it required certain external goods, health, some degree of wealth, friendship, the right social standing, without which it could not be fully realized. Zeno disagreed with both, and his disagreement was sharp and precise. The good life required exactly one thing, virtue, not virtue plus other things, not virtue as the most important among several necessary goods. Virtue alone, completely, was sufficient, and virtue had four forms. Wisdom, which the Stoics understood as the knowledge of what is truly good and what is not. Courage, which is not the absence of fear, but the correct judgment of what is genuinely worth fearing and what is not. Justice, which governs the right ordering of relations between persons who are, in the Stoic view, equally participants in the rational order that holds all things together. And temperance, which is the capacity to desire and to act in proportion, not to be governed by the pull of appetite or the push of aversion, but to move through the world with the measured, deliberate attention of a mind that knows what it is doing and why. These four, Sophia, Andrea, Dikaiosina, Sophrosine, were not ornaments of a good life. They were not qualities that a good person happens to have, in addition to other things. They were the entire substance of what the good life is. Everything else fell into a different category: wealth, health, reputation, long life, physical comfort, the love of others. These were things that a rational person might reasonably prefer to their opposites, and the Stoics acknowledged this with unusual honesty. A philosopher who claimed to be indifferent to health was probably not telling the full truth, and Stoic ethics was too careful to demand what was not actually achievable. So they introduced a distinction that is one of the most useful and carefully thought through moves in the history of moral philosophy. These other things, health, wealth, the ordinary goods that people seek, are preferred. A rational person will, other things equal, choose them over their opposites, but they are indifferent with respect to virtue. They have no ultimate moral weight. They cannot make a person genuinely good or genuinely bad. They can make life more comfortable or less, more convenient or more difficult, but they cannot reach the part of a person that is actually doing the living, the part that judges, chooses, responds and is or is not virtuous in those judgments, choices, and responses. The Stoics called these things preferred indifference, and the name is exact. Preferred, because a rational being in possession of full information will choose health over illness, adequate resources over destitution, the company of people who care about them over isolation. The preference is rational, not irrational. It does not need to be suppressed or denied. Indifferent, because the presence or absence of these things cannot touch what actually matters, which is the quality of the will, the integrity of the judgment, the alignment of the self with what is truly good. A person who has lost everything they possessed, their cargo, their ship, their plans for the season, can still have wisdom, can still have courage, can still move through the wreckage with justice and with temperance. And if they have all four of these, they have everything the good life requires. That man on the docks at Piraeus had not yet understood this, but the philosophy he would eventually build was, in some ways, the long answer to what the wreck had put to him. What remains when everything else is gone? The answer Zeno arrived at, after years of walking and studying and arguing under the painted walls of the Stoa Poikile, was, virtue remains. The capacity for right judgment remains. The rational faculty that chooses how to meet what the world presents. This is what cannot be taken by water, or time, or the bad luck of a ship on the wrong coast in the wrong season. This is what the philosophy was built to protect. After Zeno, the school he had founded continued under teachers who extended and deepened what he had begun. The man who succeeded him at the head of the school was Clintus of Assos, a former boxer from Asia Minor who had come to Athens to study philosophy, reportedly working as a water carrier at night to support himself while he learned during the day. Clintus was not Zeno's intellectual equal in systematic rigor, and those who wrote about him acknowledged this. But he had something Zeno had not possessed in the same degree, a quality of religious feeling, a deep and genuine reverence for the Logos and for the cosmos it pervaded that came through most clearly in the hymn to Zeus. He composed the hymn to Zeus, which is one of the few Stoic texts from the early period that has survived substantially intact, and which is less like a formal philosophical argument than like a prayer, addressed to the rational principle at the heart of things, grateful, open, turning toward the warmth of it, the way a face turns toward the sun. Clintus held the school together for 32 years. After him came Chrysippus of Soli. Chrysippus is the figure who made Stoicism what it eventually became, not the school's founder and not its most poetic voice, but the man who built the logical and theoretical architecture without which the tradition could not have survived rigorous examination. An ancient saying about him was precise. Without Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa. He was said to have written more than 700 works, none of which has survived in complete form, though fragments and summaries enough remain to understand what he was doing. He was a logician of the first order. He worked on propositional logic in ways that would not be rediscovered until the 19th century. He developed the Stoic theory of emotions as mistaken judgments, fear as the false belief that something genuinely bad is near, grief as the false belief that something genuinely good has been lost, in a way that made Stoic ethics defensible against some of its most serious critics. He was also, by every account, formidably argumentative. The portrait that survives is of a man who was less interested in the quality of philosophical feeling that Clintus had brought to the tradition, and more interested in making the doctrine impregnable, in finding every weak joint in the structure and reinforcing it, in answering the objections before they arrived, in constructing a logical apparatus so precise and so comprehensive that those who came after him would find not a set of inspiring intuitions, but a fully built philosophical system. He was not wrong that this was needed. Philosophy without rigor is not philosophy but aspiration, and aspiration, however sincere, cannot survive a sufficiently careful opponent. Chrysippus gave the early Stoics the rigor they needed. This early period, Zeno, Clinthus, and Chrysippus, is what historians of philosophy call the early Stoa. It was centered in Athens, concerned primarily with the systematic construction of Stoic doctrine, and concentrated in roughly equal measure on all three parts of the philosophical division Zeno had established: logic, physics, and ethics. The thinkers of this period believed these were inseparable. You could not understand how to live well without understanding the nature of the cosmos you were living in. You could not understand the cosmos without understanding how rational inference works and where it can go wrong. And none of this was separable from the question of the logos, the rational principle that made the cosmos the kind of place a rational being could align itself with, rather than a chaos to be endured. From Athens, the tradition moved slowly across centuries toward Rome. The movement involved what historians of the tradition call the Middle Stoa, the philosophers Epictetus of Rhodes and Posidonius of Apamea, who taught in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE and who carried Stoic philosophy into the circles of the Roman ruling class, adapting it along the way, making certain accommodations that the stricter Stoics of the early period had not been willing to make. Epictetus, in particular, was willing to acknowledge that the preferred indifferents were not quite as morally weightless as Zeno had insisted, that health and social standing and the relationships of civic life played a real role in the shape of a well-lived existence, even if they did not constitute its essence. He softened certain edges that Chrysippus had made sharp. The tradition became, under his influence, somewhat more livable for people who were neither professional philosophers nor wandering ascetics, and this made it more useful to the Roman aristocrats who encountered it, and found in it a framework for thinking about duty, public service, and the governance of their own emotional lives under political pressure. The shift Epictetus represented was a shift in emphasis, not a departure. What he and those who followed him were doing was taking a fully developed philosophical system and asking which parts of it would actually function as a guide for people embedded in political life, facing obligations to family and city and colleagues, navigating a world in which complete detachment from external goods was not simply unavailable, but arguably not the right goal. The tradition did not break. It bent, and in bending it reached a different set of people. By the time Stoicism arrived at Rome in its fullest form, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, under the writers and teachers who composed the texts that most people still encounter when they first encounter Stoicism at all, what the early Stoa had built in Athens had become something with a different orientation, though not a different root. The Roman Stoics did not discard what came before them. They inhabited it differently. They pressed on the ethics more than the physics. They were interested less in the cosmological architecture, the ekpyrosis, the detailed account of how the logos moves through matter, and more in the daily question of how to hold a life together under pressure, how to meet grief and fear and the temptations of comfort and ambition with the measured, deliberate attention that virtue required. They wrote not primarily for other philosophers, but for themselves and for the people around them, letters, private notebooks, discourses recorded by students who wanted to preserve what their teacher had said. The late Stoa in Rome is what left the deepest marks on the centuries that followed. 3 names define it, and each represents a life in which the philosophy was not merely studied, but lived under conditions that would test any philosophical framework against genuine weight. A former slave, a condemned statesman, an emperor at war. Between them, they wrote the documents that have carried Stoic thought across 2,000 years of changing circumstances, languages, and empires, arriving still coherent in a world Zeno could not have imagined and would, perhaps, have recognized immediately. None of them, it should be said, was simply passing along what they had received. The tradition was, in each of their hands, a living thing, something they argued with, pressed against, returned to after it had failed to comfort them, and found, in the returning, more reliable than they had first believed. This is what traditions are when they are working, not a fixed set of answers stored in a library, but a set of questions that remain genuinely open and genuinely useful across the distances of time, because the questions they address, how to live, how to hold loss, how to remain yourself when the world presses hard against you, are the same questions in every century, in every language, in every life that is honest enough to ask them. Zeno had not known any of this when he walked away from the harbor at Piraeus. He had known only that something was finished, the merchant's life, the plan for the season, the cargo of purple dye dispersing in the water, and that something else was beginning, though he could not yet have said what. The walk from the harbor to the bookseller's stall, and from the stall to the door of Crates of Thebes, and from that door to years of study, and then to the long open teaching life in the agora. All of this was still ahead of him, unknown and unplanned, the future that a shipwreck had made possible by clearing the ground. He had lost everything he had been carrying, and everything he would build began there, in the space that the loss made. Not immediately, not easily, but steadily, the way philosophy always builds, one careful step at a time, each step tested against the question of whether it holds, each one revised when it does not. The whole structure rising not from certainty, but from the willingness to keep asking, to keep returning, to put the question down and pick it up again the next day, with fresh attention and undiminished patience. The Stoic school he founded was not a building. It was the colonnade of the Stoa, open on one side to the air and the movement of the city, the painted images of Marathon behind the teacher's back, the Athenian agora spreading in every direction with its ordinary traffic of commerce and argument and daily life. Anyone who stopped could hear, anyone who had a question could stay. The philosophy was not hidden behind a gate, or available only to the chosen or the wealthy. It was offered in the open air to whoever happened to be passing and happened to pause and happened to find that what was being said in that painted porch had something in it worth hearing. The men who stopped were not all philosophers. Some were merchants like Zeno had been. Some were craftsmen taking a longer way home. Some were lawyers who had finished for the day in the courts nearby and had nothing urgent pressing. Some were students, young and argumentative, and hungry for a framework that would hold when they pressed against it. They stopped and they listened. And sometimes they stayed long enough to find that the account of the good life being offered in that open colonnade was not a consolation for people who had already lost everything, but a preparation, a way of understanding what they had and what they were that would serve them, whether the ships came in or the ships went down. This is what the Stoa was, in the end, not a school in the private sense, not a retreat from the city, not a garden enclosed against the noise of ordinary life. A covered walkway, open to the morning and the afternoon and the long, slow afternoons of an Athenian day, with the painted ghosts of Marathon on the wall behind the teacher and the living world of the agora spread out before the listeners, and in between these two, between the great painted past and the ordinary moving present, a philosophy being built and tested and refined in the hearing of whoever cared to slow their step for a moment and attend to what it was saying. The painted porch, the morning light through the columns, the voice of a man who had once stood on a dock among wreckage and decided that what the world had taken from him was not what had mattered most. The ordinary Athenians, pausing mid-errand, hearing something in the air worth stopping for, standing still in the open colonnade for a moment longer than they had planned, the day still waiting for them on the other side of those columns, the philosophy settling into them quietly, without urgency, the way any lasting thing settles, not all at once and not noisily, but in the patient, unhurried manner of something that has nowhere else to be and knows it. On the northern edge of the Roman Empire, in a military camp pitched along the Danube frontier, a lamp burns past the hour when most men have stopped thinking. The year is somewhere in the 170 seps of the Common Era. The man seated at the camp table is the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful single human being alive by any measure the ancient world could construct, and he is writing in Greek, not Latin, the language of empire and command, but Greek, the language he chose for the work he most needed to do, which was the work of examining himself. The pages accumulating before him were addressed to no one. They were never prepared for a reader. They were the record of a man attempting, night after night, in whatever quiet the frontier allowed, to hold himself honestly to something he believed with his entire mind, but found consistently difficult to inhabit with his entire life. The book that survived is called The Meditations, and it reads less like philosophy polished for an audience than like a man in private conversation with his own better judgment. Marcus Aurelius returns to the same themes across its 12 books, with the patience of someone who is not writing about ideas he has resolved, but about ground he needs to visit again, because the day has made it slippery. He reminds himself repeatedly what cannot be taken from him. He names the thing the way a person names something they need to see clearly. He calls it, in one of the book's most recurring images, a citadel. The citadel he meant was not made of stone. It had no walls that cavalry could breach, and no gates that could be forced open. What Marcus Aurelius meant by the citadel was the rational mind in its own sovereign capacity, the part of a person that whatever the outer world arranged around it could retire into itself and find, in that retirement, a completeness the outer world had never been equipped to provide. He did not present this as a consoling fiction for difficult circumstances. He offered it as a description of how things actually stood, of what was genuinely real, of where the only reliable peace had always been located. The emperor who commanded the legions of Rome was telling himself, in a language no one around him was likely to read, that the most secure place available to any human being was not a palace in Rome, but a faculty they had carried since birth without fully noticing what it was. The idea had not originated with Marcus Aurelius. It came to him through a tradition already 4 centuries old, through teachers who had themselves inherited it from others, through a philosophical architecture built up from a set of foundational claims about what a person actually is and what, as a consequence, can actually be protected. To follow the argument, to understand why the citadel is real, why it holds, why the peace it contains is not a metaphor but a structural feature of rational life. It is necessary to go to the person who built the argument in its most rigorous and most personal form, the person who had more reason than almost anyone else in the ancient world to need the argument to be true. Epictetus had been a slave. Born around 50 CE in Hierapolis, in what is now western Turkey, he was brought to Rome as property and owned by a freedman of Nero named Epaphroditus. The facts of his enslavement are sparse and matter less than what he made of them, philosophically, not because the facts were unimportant, but because Epictetus himself insisted, with a rigor that was either deeply liberating or very demanding, depending on how honestly one followed it, that the facts of external circumstance were never the point. What mattered, in his account, was something that the circumstance could not touch. He had noticed this. He had not merely theorized it in a lecture hall, but had examined it against the actual pressure of a life that had been subject to the total power of another person's will, and he had found it to hold. The line he drew, the single line from which his entire philosophical structure descended, was between what he called ephemon and what was not. The Greek phrase is usually translated as up to us, though the older translation in our power carries something the shorter version loses. What is up to us, Epictetus said, are our judgments, our desires, our aversions, and our impulses, the inner movements of the mind as it encounters the world, assesses the world, and chooses how to orient itself toward what the world presents. What is not up to us is everything else: the body, reputation, property, the opinions of others, the behavior of other people, the outcomes of events we have set in motion. All of this lies outside the boundary. It may be preferred or avoided, it may be pleasant or painful, but it is not, in the deep sense Epictetus meant, ours. The line sounds simple. Lived with carefully, it is not simple at all, and Epictetus knew this. He spent his career teaching it to students who thought they understood it, and then discovered, under examination, that they had only understood it in the way one understands the floor plan of a building they have never entered. A wealthy man can nod at the distinction between what is his and what is not, and continue to organize his inner life entirely around his wealth. A healthy man can acknowledge that health is not genuinely up to him and continue to be devastated when it changes. The line is not crossed by agreeing with it intellectually. It is crossed by actually honestly and persistently concentrating the whole force of one's care on the small domain that truly belongs to one, and releasing with genuine equanimity, rather than performed acceptance, everything on the other side. What Epictetus was pointing at when he drew this line was not a technique for managing disappointment. He was pointing at the actual structure of human freedom as he understood it. Because if what is genuinely up to us is restricted to the inner movements of the mind, the judgments, the desires, the aversions, the impulses, then within that domain, and only within it, something remarkable holds: complete sovereignty. No external power can compel a judgment. No tyrant can mandate a desire. No circumstance can force an aversion the mind refuses to adopt. This is not an optimistic claim about human resilience. It is a philosophical claim about the nature of rational agency, that the innermost act of the mind, the act of assent, belongs to the mind alone and cannot be relocated by force into another's hands. The Stoics gave this sovereign faculty a name. They called it the hegemonikon, which translates roughly as the ruling part or leading faculty of the soul. In their understanding of what a person is, the hegemonikon was the seat of everything that made a human being distinctively human: the capacity for reason, for judgment, for moral choice, for the assessment of impressions that the world presents to awareness. The early Stoics, particularly Chrysippus, had a precise account of where this faculty resided and how it operated, built from their broader theory of the soul as a unified pneumatic substance pervading the body. But what matters for the present purposes is not the anatomy of their account, but the quality of the thing they were describing. The hegemonikon, as the Stoics understood it, was the part of a person most fully composed of logos, the rational principle they believed ordered the cosmos, and therefore the part most capable of alignment with the structure of things as they actually were. What this meant in practice was something with considerable weight to it. If the hegemonicon is genuinely sovereign, if it is genuinely composed of the rational principle that runs through all things, then the mind that turns inward and finds it is not finding a private refuge from the world. It is finding the place where the self and the cosmos most fully coincide. The citadel Marcus Aurelius described was not a withdrawal from reality. It was, in the Stoic account, a return to the most real dimension of the self, and through it, to the most real dimension of everything. This is what Epictetus stood in front of his students in Nicopolis to teach. He taught in Nicopolis because he had been expelled from Rome, along with the other philosophers, when the Emperor Domitian, in 89 CE, sent them from the city. He was free by then. At some point between his birth and his emergence as a teacher, he had been freed, though the exact circumstances are not recorded. What is recorded is the school he ran, the students who came to him from across the Roman world, the careful arguments he made to people who arrived believing they understood what was good and left discovering that they had only understood it approximately. He appears in the record as a man not given to performance or theater, but as someone consistently focused on the single question of whether the people in front of him were actually living according to what they claimed to know. The specific mechanism by which Epictetan Stoicism proposed to hold the inner citadel was called synkatathesis, the discipline of assent. The idea was this: between the world and the mind, between what happens and what the mind does with what happens, there is a moment. The Stoics called the initial presentation of experience a fantasia, an impression, and they noted that impressions do not arrive carrying their interpretations ready-made. What arrives is the raw material. What the mind does with it, whether it accepts the impression, what it adds to the impression, what narrative it builds around the impression, is a separate act, and that act is the act of assent. The impression arrives, a sharp word, a perceived slight, the news of something lost. The impression says, in effect, here is how things stand, but the impression is not automatically right. The impression often carries distortions, additions, evaluations that are not inherent in the bare event, but are contributed by the mind's habitual machinery, the tendency to catastrophize, to personalize, to treat the indifferent as significant, to see threat where there is only change. And here is what the Stoics held. Before assent is given, there is a pause. The pause may be very brief, but it is real. And in that pause, the mind retains the capacity to withhold, to examine what the impression is claiming before deciding whether to accept the claim. This is not a counsel of cold detachment. The Stoics were careful to distinguish between the eupatheia, the good emotions that follow from correct judgment, among them joy, caution, and wishing, and the pathé, the emotions that follow from false beliefs about what is good or bad, among them fear, grief, and desire for things that are not genuinely up to us. The discipline of assent was not an instruction to feel nothing. It was an instruction to feel what was accurate, which, practiced carefully, turned out to produce not a diminished emotional life, but a steadier and more honest one. The citadel was not cold, it was simply clear. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his tent on the Danube, with the lamp burning and the camp quiet outside, returns in the Meditations to this mechanism with the regularity of someone who has found it useful. He describes the mind's capacity to assent or withhold assent in several places, and he returns repeatedly to the image of fire, specifically to the image of a fire that assimilates everything it touches. A great fire, fed with obstacles, does not diminish. The obstacles become part of it. The wet wood that would dampen a small flame is consumed by a large one and adds to its heat. Marcus Aurelius used this image to describe the disciplined mind's relationship with adversity, not resistance, not suppression, but transformation. The obstacle arrives. The mind that has cultivated itself does not flinch from the obstacle, does not fight the obstacle on the obstacle's own terms, does not go out in the cold air of the obstacle's challenge. It assimilates. The difficulty becomes material. This is a harder claim than it sounds, and Marcus Aurelius knew it was hard because he was testing it in conditions that were genuinely difficult. The frontier campaigns on the Danube were brutal, prolonged, and costly. The pressures of the imperium were enormous. The people around him, in the court, in the Senate, in the command structure, were sometimes corrupt, sometimes treacherous, sometimes simply maddening in the ordinary human way. He writes about them in the Meditations with a frustration that is unmistakable, and then he writes about how to correct that frustration, how to return to the ground from which it can be seen clearly. What is compelling about the Meditations is not the equanimity they project, but the effort they record, the specific nightly effort of a man who believed in the architecture of the Citadel and was persistently, honestly finding it difficult to live inside it without slipping out. There is something in this that the cleaner philosophical statements do not capture, and that is worth sitting with. Epictetus drew the line between what is ours and what is not, and the line holds as philosophy. But Epictetus himself appears in the record as someone for whom the practice had become so complete that he barely seemed to need the reminder. Marcus Aurelius appears in the record as someone who needed the reminder every night and gave it to himself every night, and kept returning to it, not because the argument had failed, but because the argument was deep and the habits of the mind are persistent. And genuine philosophy is not one insight followed by permanent resolution, but a practice sustained across a life that keeps presenting the same essential question in new forms. The question the Meditations keep returning to is what is actually mine? Not as property, not as possession in any material sense, but as the thing that defines the boundary of genuine freedom. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the Roman world, and he kept reminding himself in Greek, in private, by lamplight, of what was genuinely his, and the answer was the same as the answer Epictetus had worked out in Nicopolis, the same answer that had been available since Zeno first articulated the foundational distinction. What was his was the inner movement, the judgment, the orientation of the will. Nothing outside that boundary was his in any meaningful sense, and nothing outside that boundary needed to be defended as if it were. The image of the lamp is useful here. Imagine a lamp burning at the center of a large room. The lamp does not govern the weather outside the window. It does not prevent the draft from moving under the door, the temperature of the outer air, the sound of the rain, the quality of the darkness beyond the glass. None of these are within the lamp's authority, but the lamp's light is entirely its own. The quality of that light, its steadiness, its warmth, the way it fills the room it can fill, these belong to the lamp in the only sense that matters, and nothing outside the room can extinguish the lamp without the room's own conditions permitting it. The hegemonikon is the lamp. The philosophy that Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius were both practicing by different routes and under very different circumstances was the practice of tending it. What makes the Citadel metaphor work, beyond its philosophical precision, is the quality of what the Citadel does not need. A fortress at siege draws everything toward defense, every resource allocated to the perimeter, every attention directed outward toward the approaching threat. The inner citadel that Marcus Aurelius described does the opposite. It is not preparing for something, it is not bracing. It is simply present in itself, requiring nothing from outside to complete it. The peace it contains is not the peace of danger, temporarily absent. It is the peace of a space that is by its nature not vulnerable to the particular class of disturbances that trouble the outer life. An insult cannot reach it. A disappointment cannot breach it. Not because these things are not felt. They are felt. Marcus Aurelius felt them. Epictetus felt them. But because the part of the person they can reach is not the part where the citadel stands. Epictetus described this in the Discourses with characteristic directness. The tyrant can imprison the body, he said. The tyrant can threaten the livelihood, the reputation, the freedom of movement. None of this reaches the will. The will that consents to its own imprisonment has been defeated. The will that maintains its own orientation, even inside a prison, has not been touched. This was not, for Epictetus, an abstract philosophical position. It was a report from a life that had been tested in exactly this way, and the report was that the will held. There is something quietly important about the fact that Epictetus chose to teach this doctrine to wealthy and powerful students. The men who came to his school in Nicopolis, and it was, for the most part, men, were people who had significant outer resources, property, position, social standing. They came to a man who had once owned nothing, not even himself, to be instructed in freedom. Epictetus did not find this ironic. He found it accurate. The freedom he was teaching was not a compensation for the absence of outer goods. It was a different category of thing entirely, available in identical measure to the emperor and to the slave, which was not a sentimental claim, but a structural one, following directly from the argument about what freedom actually was. The students who followed this argument carefully and honestly encountered something that was, in the early stages, uncomfortable, because the argument required, genuinely and without escape clause, the release of everything outside the boundary, not the performed release, not the theoretical acknowledgement of impermanence, but the actual and settled relinquishment of the claim that any of it was truly mine, in the sense that mattered. The reputation was not mine. The outcome of the project was not mine. The health of the body was not mine. It could be preferred, could be cared for, could be attended to as a preferred indifferent, but it was not mine in the sense that its loss would constitute a loss of something actually belonging to the self. Working through this honestly was not always comfortable, especially for people whose entire sense of themselves had been organized around things on the wrong side of the line. But there was something waiting on the other side of that discomfort that the argument pointed toward. Because once the release was genuine, once the grip on the outer goods had actually loosened rather than merely been described as loose, what remained was something unexpected. What remained was the thing that had always been there, which had never needed defending because it had never been at risk. The will that judged, the will that oriented, the will that chose, moment by moment, what to assent to and what to withhold assent from. This thing, freed from the defensive posture it had been holding on behalf of things it was never equipped to protect, could turn its full attention to its own proper work, which was, in the Stoic account, the work of virtue, not as an ornament, but as the only activity that used the will in its full capacity. Marcus Aurelius returned to this in the Meditations in a passage that has the quality of a very late-night thought, written past the hour when arguments are made, and into the hour when a man says what he actually believes. He wrote that the mind, by its nature, is sufficient. He did not mean this in the sense of self-satisfaction or independence from the world. He meant it in the precise philosophical sense that the mind's essential activity, reasoning, judging, assenting, required nothing outside itself to be fully what it was. The emperor needed his legions to hold the Danube. He needed his court to administer the empire. He needed food and sleep and the continued functioning of a body that had been giving him trouble for years. None of this was what he meant when he wrote that the mind was sufficient. He meant the thing at the center, the hegemonikon, the lamp that did its work regardless of what surrounded it, and that found, in doing its work, a fullness that the outer circumstances could neither provide nor prevent. There is a kind of rest available in this account that is different from the rest of comfort or the rest of safety. Comfort can be disturbed, safety can be threatened. What the Stoic account points toward is a rest more fundamental than either, the rest of a mind that has found the boundary of what is genuinely its own and stopped trying to defend the territory on the other side. The trying is exhausting, not the outer work of managing a life, which can be done with equanimity, but the inner work of gripping, of trying to hold by force of will the things that do not belong to the will and never did. The citadel does not require effort to maintain. It requires only the recognition of what it is, which is a different kind of work altogether, the work of returning, repeatedly, honestly, without self-punishment, when the return is necessary, to the understanding that the sovereign faculty was never anywhere else. The Danube camp, on a night in the 170s, would have been cold. The frontier was always cold in the season when the river threatened to freeze, and the military situation required constant attention. Marcus Aurelius, seated at the camp table with the lamp burning and the page before him, was surrounded by everything the world meant when it talked about power and consequence and difficulty. The empire, the frontier, the campaigns that would not end, the court that required managing even from this distance, the body that was already beginning to fail him in the particular ways the body eventually fails, everyone. He was surrounded by all of it, and he sat down, in Greek, and wrote himself back toward the place where none of it could follow, not because the place was inaccessible to difficulty. Marcus Aurelius was not writing from a position of peace already achieved. He was writing toward it, the way a person walks deliberately toward something they know is there, but have drifted from during the day's business. The drifting was not failure, the returning was the practice. The practice was the philosophy, not as argument, but as actual nightly motion, the turning inward that the argument described as always available, and that life made persistently easy to forget. The citadel had no dimensions that could be drawn on a map. It had no location in the camp, no room among the tents, no address in Rome or Athens or Nicopolis. The Stoics were precise about this. What could not be located in the outer world was not therefore unreal. It was simply real in the way that the capacity for judgment is real, in the way that the act of choosing is real, in the way that the orientation of the will toward what it knows to be genuinely good is real, not physically located, but completely present. Available, the instant attention turns in its direction, undiminished by the hours of the day that had not been spent in it. Marcus Aurelius called it a retreat into oneself. He meant something specific by this, not withdrawal from the world's obligations, which he never abandoned, but the regular disciplined practice of returning to the faculty that was most fully his, the faculty that the day's events had been pressing against without managing to enter. A practice general can retreat to a position of strength without conceding the battle. The retreat to the inner citadel was not a concession to the world's difficulty. It was a return to the ground from which the difficulty could be engaged most clearly, most steadily, most completely, in accordance with what the person actually believed. The philosophy that Marcus Aurelius was practicing on the Danube frontier, the same philosophy that Epictetus had worked out in Nicopolis from the materials of a very different life, was not a promise that the outer world would become easier. The world on the Danube was not easier because Marcus Aurelius understood the dichotomy of control. The world under Nero was not safer because Epictetus drew the line between what was up to him and what was not. The philosophy made no promises about the outer world because the outer world was precisely the domain it had relinquished the pretense of controlling. What it promised instead was something that had always been within reach and that the noise of the outer world had been covering, the quiet, persistent, sovereign capacity of the mind to turn inward and find in the turning a peace that was not waiting for circumstances to improve. The citadel, finally, is not a fortress. The word carries the weight of walls and defense and the posture of something braced against an attack. But the image Marcus Aurelius returned to, across all the books of the Meditations, was softer than that. It was the image of a space that was simply itself, not reactive, not armored, not held by force, but held by nature. A space that had always been there, that required no construction and no defense, that was available at the end of any ordinary day to anyone who turned toward it. The emperor with his legions and the former slave with his school had both found the same room. The room had no door that could be locked from the outside. What it required was only the decision to step into it and to let the noise that had accumulated through the hours of the day stand where it was, outside, without being invited in, not fought, not suppressed, simply not followed into the quiet. The quiet was there. It had always been there. It was the quality of the hegemonicon itself, the ruling faculty in its natural state, before the day's impressions had been given full assent and turned into the kind of weather that fills a mind and makes it forget. The lamp is still burning at the center of the room. The lamp is still burning. It burns through the campaigns and the failures and the pressures and the griefs that touch the outer life without touching the thing at the center. In the Stoic account, this is not a hope. It is a description of what has always been there. Quiet, sufficient, available, waiting with the patience of something that does not need to be found because it has never been anywhere else. The room is simply still, and the stillness was there all along, underneath the noise, steady and without condition, exactly as close as the next breath turned inward toward it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Greek, "This is a small fact, easy to pass over, but it stays with the mind when considered for a moment. He was a Roman emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, commanding legions along the Danube frontier, administering an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. And when he sat down each night to address himself, to remind himself, to measure himself, to correct himself, he chose a language that was not the language of his office or his army or his court. He chose the language of philosophy. The choice says something quiet and precise about what those private pages were for. They were not record-keeping. They were not correspondence. They were something closer to what a man might do when he steps away from everything he is expected to be and attempts in the solitude of a night that belongs only to him to remember what he actually thinks. The Meditations, though he gave them no title, intended no reader, and never revised them for any audience, have survived nearly 2,000 years and are still read not as historical curiosity, but as something people carry in their pockets. This is unusual for the private journal of anyone, let alone for the private journal of a second-century Roman emperor. What has kept them alive is not the power of the man who wrote them, but the honesty, There is no performance in them. There is, on page after page, a person who has held Stoic philosophy for decades, who genuinely believes its claims, and who finds returning to those beliefs each night that he has fallen short of them again today, and who is not destroyed by this discovery, but who simply notes it, examines it, and resolves to try again in the morning. The campaigns on the Danube were long and cold and difficult. The Marcomannic Wars stretched through the years of Marcus's reign, keeping him from Rome, from the library, from the intellectual life he had preferred from boyhood. He had not chosen this. He had not chosen to be emperor at all, not in the way a man chooses a profession. He had been designated by Hadrian, raised by Antoninus Pius, handed an office whose weight he seems to have felt every day of the more than 2 decades he held it. And still the journal continues, night after night, campaign after campaign, in Greek, still the same questions. Have I been patient today? Have I remembered what genuinely matters? Have I treated the men around me as the rational creatures they are? The questions are not answered and then set aside. They are asked again tomorrow and the day after that, with the same careful attention, as though the asking itself is the practice. What he was practicing in the most literal sense was Stoic philosophy, not as an intellectual system to be admired, but as a set of tools to be used, imperfectly and repeatedly, until the use became something more like character. The Stoics had always insisted on this. Philosophy that did not change how one actually lived was not philosophy at all. By their account, it was decoration. And Marcus, emperor, general, administrator of a civilization, returned each night to the same private discipline, not to record what had happened, but to ask whether what had happened had been met with the kind of mind the philosophy required. He was not alone in this insistence. The figures who kept Stoic thought alive across the Roman world shared a particular quality. They had all tested the doctrine against actual conditions, conditions that included slavery, exile, political danger, and proximity to death, and they had found it, under those pressures, more rather than less useful. This is what gives their writing its specific weight. It is not the weight of ideas defended in comfort. It is the weight of ideas carried under difficulty and not discarded. Epictetus was born in Hierapolis, in what is now Western Turkey, around 50 CE. He came to Rome as a slave. His master was Epaphroditus, a freedman of the Emperor Nero, and Epictetus spent years in Rome, not as a student of philosophy, but as a man who had no legal standing, no property, and no claim to his own time or body. At some point he was freed. The details are not entirely clear, as is common with lives that were not considered worth recording in full. What is clear is that after his freedom, he established a school in Nicopolis, on the northwestern coast of Greece, and that students came to him from across the Roman world to be taught philosophy by a man who had been property. The students who came were often from the opposite end of Roman social life. They were wealthy, some were well connected. They arrived, presumably, with the expectation that Epictetus would teach them the arguments, the logic of the Stoic position, the cosmological framework, the doctrines that circulated among educated Romans as marks of a cultivated mind. What Epictetus appears to have given them instead was something less comfortable and considerably more useful. He gave them again and again the same single distinction: what belongs to you and what does not. Your judgments belong to you. Your desires and aversions and impulses, as far as they can be directed, belong to you. Everything outside this, the opinions of others, the health of the body, the stability of fortune, the behavior of the world, belongs to a category you do not own and cannot finally control. Spend your effort inside your circle, he told them. Everything spent outside it is wasted. This argument had a particular authority coming from him. He was not a man who had chosen poverty and independence as a philosophical gesture, the way some of his predecessors had. He had been in the position of having nothing, nothing recognized by law as his, nothing his master could not take, and he had discovered, or claimed to have discovered, that even in that position there was a territory that remained sovereign, not a physical territory, not a social one, something more interior and more difficult to name, the capacity to decide, even within conditions of total external constraint, how to meet what was happening. That capacity, he taught, is what no master can take. That capacity is what the whole philosophical project is, in the business of cultivating and protecting. His students recorded his teaching in the Discourses, 4 books of what are essentially lecture notes, taken down by a student named Arian, who had the foresight to write rather than simply listen. Arian also compiled the Enchiridion, a shorter handbook that distills the core of Epictetus's teaching into a form that could be held in the mind and returned to. Both texts carry the quality of a living voice, blunt, sometimes impatient, occasionally warm, always returning to the same ground. Because the ground for Epictetus was the whole of it. Every philosophical question leads back eventually to the same question: what is yours, and are you attending to it? Musonius Rufus taught Epictetus, and what he passed to his student was already shaped by decades of the same insistence that philosophy without enactment is not philosophy. Musonius taught in Rome in the 1st century CE and was exiled twice, under Nero and under Vespasian, for the kind of frank, uncomfortable teaching that Roman emperors have historically not enjoyed receiving. He returned both times. He continued teaching. He did not, apparently, consider exile particularly significant as a response to the central question of how to live, because exile falls into the category of things that happen to the body and the social position, and these, by his account, are precisely the things that do not determine the quality of a life. What Musonius is best remembered for, among those who remember him, is his insistence on the absolute ordinariness of philosophical practice. Philosophy is not a set of doctrines to be mastered, he told his students. It is a discipline of attention and choice enacted in each particular moment of a particular day. The table is a site of philosophical practice. The morning is a site of philosophical practice. The choice to eat plainly rather than extravagantly, to sleep simply rather than in elaborate comfort, to bear a minor inconvenience without the flare of irritation, these are not footnotes to the philosophical life. These are the philosophical life. The argument is not proved in the lecture hall. It is proved or disproved in the kitchen, in the garden, at breakfast, in the 10,000 small choices that accumulate, over years, into something that either resembles virtue or does not. There is something in this that can feel, at first, like a reduction. Surely philosophy is more than breakfast. Surely the tradition that produced systematic cosmology and formal logic and a theory of the passions as mistaken judgments is not finally about what a person eats in the morning. But Musonius's point is not that philosophy is small. His point is that philosophy is continuous, that it does not exist only in the hours of formal reflection, but runs through every hour, and that a philosophy practiced only during study and abandoned during meals is a philosophy that has not yet been fully believed. The test of a genuine conviction is that it shapes behavior in the moments when no one is watching and no applause is available. The test, in other words, is breakfast. Seneca was more complicated, and he knew it. He lived his philosophy imperfectly, acknowledged the imperfection in the same breath as the argument, and went on writing anyway with what appears to have been something very close to honesty about the gap between the ideal and the actual. He was immensely wealthy, well connected to power, a man who had navigated the lethal politics of imperial Rome and had survived for a time by being useful to people who were capable of ordering his death. He served as Nero's tutor and advisor. The relationship was dangerous and eventually fatal. In 65 CE, accused of involvement in a conspiracy, he was ordered to take his own life. He did, but before that, during the last years of his life, when the political ground had grown uncertain and his influence with the emperor was declining, he retreated increasingly to philosophy and produced the Epistulae Moralis ad Lucilium, 124 letters addressed to his friend Gaius Lucilius, who was younger and who had written to ask Seneca to teach him. The letters that came back are not quite like anything else in the philosophical tradition. They are too personal to be treatises and too careful to be merely correspondence. They read like a man thinking aloud, urgently, not because he is alarmed, but because he has come to understand that the number of hours remaining is not infinite, and that the question of what to do with hours, really and concretely, is the question he most wants to have answered before he has no more of them. His argument about time is among the most quietly insistent in all of ancient philosophy. The common complaint, he writes, is that life is short. But life, he says, is not short. It is long enough, more than long enough, for the things that genuinely matter. What is short is the portion of life a person actually inhabits. The rest is surrendered to distraction, to the performance of ambition, to the anxious management of reputation, to the 100 forms of avoidance that fill the hours without filling them. Most people, by Seneca's account, are not living their hours so much as spending them, the way money is spent on things that do not finally satisfy, and finding themselves, at the end, in a kind of poverty that is not about what they lack, but about what they have not attended to. Reclaim your time, he tells Lucilius, not dramatically, not by abandoning everything and withdrawing to a hillside, and reclaim it by the steady daily practice of attending to what actually matters, to the life of the mind, to genuine friendship, to the cultivation of virtue, rather than to the substitute urgencies that feel pressing but are not. The letters carry a quality of warmth that is not always associated with Stoic philosophy, whose reputation, somewhat unfairly, tends toward the austere. Seneca is not austere. He is fond of Lucilius, and the fondness shows in the way he writes, less like a teacher delivering a lesson than like a friend thinking through something he has been working on for years and wants finally to articulate to someone he trusts. He quotes Epictetus generously, noting without embarrassment that a good idea is a good idea regardless of which school produced it. He acknowledges his own failures of consistency with a dry candor that reads, 2,000 years later, as genuinely appealing. He is trying, he says, and he is falling short, and the falling short is not a reason to stop trying. In one of the letters, he describes walking through his estate and noticing that an old plane tree he planted decades ago is now large enough to provide real shade. He had a hand in this, he notes. The tree that is now shading him required the planting that his younger self attended to. The thought is not grand. It is a man in his garden noticing the passage of time in the growth of a tree, and finding in it a particular quality of satisfaction, the satisfaction of having invested in something that was going to take a long time to become what it needed to become. The letter does not announce this as a lesson. It simply describes it and lets the description do what description does when it is careful enough. It makes the thought available to anyone who happens to be sitting with it. Chrysippus of Soli, The third head of the Stoic school in Athens comes to the tradition from a different angle, not the intimate and epistolary register of Seneca, not the blunt pedagogical urgency of Epictetus, not the private self-examination of Marcus Aurelius, but the systematic. Chrysippus was, by the accounts that survive, an extraordinary builder of arguments. He wrote prolifically. Ancient sources attribute hundreds of works to him, almost none of which survive, and his task, as he seems to have understood it, was to take the foundations that Zeno had laid and Clinthus had tended, and to construct on them a philosophical architecture that was rigorous enough to stand against any objection. He was, in the phrase attributed to ancient admirers, the man who gave the Stoic tradition its spine. His contribution to the theory of the passions is among the most consequential things he did. The question he was addressing is one that any thoughtful person eventually arrives at. What are emotions, really, and can they be changed? The answer that most people assume, that emotions are something that happens to the body, something physiological and involuntary, something that the mind observes but does not produce, was not Chrysippus's answer. His answer was that the passions, as the Stoics called them, the distressing forms of emotion, the fear and the grief and the anxious desire, are not physiological events that the mind then responds to. They are judgments. They are the mind's own assessments of whether something is genuinely good or genuinely bad. And in almost every case, when the emotion is distressing, the judgment is false. Fear, on this account, is not a physiological response to a perceived threat. Fear is the implicit judgment that something genuinely bad is about to happen. Grief is the judgment that something genuinely valuable has been lost. The distress and the passion comes not from the situation, but from the judgment embedded in it, and judgments, unlike physiological events, can be examined, questioned, and corrected. If wealth is not genuinely good in the deepest sense, if it is, as the Stoics argued, something that can be preferred and reasonably sought, but that does not constitute virtue and cannot determine the quality of a life, then the fear of losing it rests on a false premise, and the fear traced back to that premise can be gently disaggregated from the mind that has been holding it. This is not a claim that fear simply disappears once the argument is understood. Chrysippus was not naive about the relationship between intellectual conviction and emotional experience. The full Stoic view acknowledged what they called propatheia, the initial involuntary flickers of response that precede any judgment, the momentary physical lurch before the mind has time to assess. These are not passions in the full sense. These are the body's first motion, before the will has spoken. What the Stoic practice is in the business of training is what comes after that first motion, the moment when the mind accepts the impression and builds on it, or the moment when the mind pauses, examines, and declines to endorse what first arose. The distinction is not subtle once it is felt. The difference between the first startled catch of breath when something goes wrong and the sustained distress that follows hours later, that is the space in which the whole of the Stoic practice lives. The first is outside anyone's immediate control. The second is slowly and imperfectly and with genuine effort over a long period of time. Educable. Chrysippus built the theoretical architecture that explained why this was so. The men and women who read and practiced and taught Stoic philosophy in the centuries after him are the record of what that architecture looked like when people actually tried to live inside it. What becomes visible, looking across these figures together, is something that does not always come through in philosophical writing that treats Stoicism as a set of doctrines to be catalogued. These were people with biographies. They had circumstances that made the philosophy personally urgent in ways that purely theoretical inquiry rarely requires. Epictetus had been a slave and knew from the inside what it meant to have the entire exterior scaffolding of a life removed, and to have to find, not philosophically, but actually, something that could not be removed. Marcus Aurelius had been given an empire he had not sought, and spent the remainder of his life trying to discharge its obligations without being destroyed by them. Seneca had watched men he knew be killed by a regime he was close to, had written about the good life from within a court that was capable of ending his at any moment, and had found in the philosophy not an escape from that situation, but a way of remaining upright inside it. This is not incidental to the philosophy. The philosophy did not, for any of them, exist in a separate chamber from the life that was happening around it. It was the life that was happening. The writing is the record of the attempt, imperfect, repeated, sometimes falling short, always returned to bring thought and conduct into alignment. And what makes the writing still available, still usable by people in circumstances it could never have anticipated, is precisely this: not the systematic architecture, though the architecture is there and it is impressive, but the quality of trying. The honest acknowledgement that the gap between the ideal and the actual is permanent, that the practice is not something you finish, and that the value of returning to it each day is not diminished by the fact of having returned to it the day before and still not arrived. Musonius Rufus, in one of the fragments that survive from his teaching, makes a point about what distinguishes the kind of philosopher who is genuinely practicing from the kind who is merely studying. The one who is merely studying, he says, learns what has been written and said and argued and holds it as knowledge and can account for it when asked. The one who is genuinely practicing is doing something different and in some ways harder. That one is attending to behavior, to the concrete, daily, unremarkable texture of how each hour is met, and is using philosophy not as an object of knowledge, but as a tool of transformation applied to the particular situation in front of them, right now, at this table, in this conversation, in this small difficulty, that no philosophical text specifically anticipated. The difference is not about intelligence or understanding, it is about application. And application, by Musonius's account, is the only place where philosophy actually lives. The argument can be as rigorous as Chrysippus made it, as architecturally ambitious as the 3 centuries of Stoic school building that preceded the Roman period. But if the argument is not being carried into the breakfast table, into the morning, into the small discomfort willingly borne, and the small anger deliberately set aside, then the philosophy is not yet philosophy in the fullest sense. It is a preparation for philosophy, waiting for someone to pick it up and actually use it. What this requires, each of these figures suggests in their different ways, is not genius or exceptional willpower or a temperament naturally suited to equanimity. It requires something more like practice in the literal sense, the kind that musicians and craftspeople are familiar with, the returning to the same material day after day with attention, not expecting mastery from any single session, but trusting that mastery, of a kind, accumulates. Epictetus was not born serene. Seneca was not naturally detached from the pleasures and dangers of Roman life. Marcus Aurelius was not, by the evidence of the journals, someone who found the Stoic practice easy or automatic. He was someone who found it worth doing anyway, imperfectly, repeatedly, for decades, because the alternative to be moved entirely by circumstance, to let the quality of each day depend on what the day brought, seemed to him genuinely worse. The letters Seneca wrote to Lucilius in those final years have a quality that is not exactly urgency, but is not exactly calm either. They are the letters of a man who has arrived, late but not too late, at a very clear sense of what matters, and who is writing to a friend not to perform this clarity, but to share it, because sharing it is one of the things that matter. He is not trying to save Lucilius or convince him of something he has not earned the right to hold. He is simply thinking aloud, carefully, about the questions that have occupied him most, about time, about friendship, about the difference between a life that is long and a life that has been genuinely inhabited, and trusting that the thinking made available to someone who asked for it might be of some use. One of the things Seneca returns to most consistently is the quality of attention, not dramatic attention, not the focused intensity of a mind in crisis, but the steady, unhurried attentiveness of a mind that has learned to be present to what is actually happening, rather than to its own projections about what might happen next, or its recollections of what happened before. This quality of attention is for Seneca both a philosophical practice and its own reward. The mind that is genuinely here, in this hour, attending to this conversation, this thought, this view from this window, that mind is living in a way that the mind running through its anxieties about next week is not. Not because next week is unimportant, but because next week is not what is available. This hour is available, this moment, and a philosophy that does not help with this hour, Seneca seems to feel, has missed the point. In the fragment of Musonius on the philosopher's breakfast, the argument that the table is as much a site of philosophical practice as the lecture hall, there is a lightness that is easy to miss if the point is not attended to. He is not being ascetic. He is not demanding that his students eat poorly or punish themselves with deprivation. He is pointing at something considerably more interesting, the possibility that the small choices of a day, attended to with genuine care, carry the same philosophical weight as the large ones, that how something is eaten with what quality of attention, with what relationship to appetite and satisfaction, with what awareness of the difference between what the body genuinely needs and what comfort or habit demands, is philosophically significant in exactly the way that the large questions of virtue and justice are philosophically significant, because the large questions are made of small ones. The character that meets a genuine crisis with equanimity is the same character that met this morning's minor inconvenience with equanimity. The equanimity was being built quietly in all the ordinary hours before the extraordinary one arrived. Marcus Aurelius, in one of the entries in his journal, writes something that has the quality of a man who has been thinking for a very long time and has arrived that evening at something that feels approximately true. He writes that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. The formulation is careful and compressed, and what it is pointing at is something the whole of his life and writing is in the business of demonstrating, that the difficulty is not a problem to be solved before the real work of living begins. The difficulty is the material the real work of living is made from. The cold morning, the difficult conversation, the plan that does not unfold as intended, these are not interruptions of the philosophical life. These are its occasions. These are where the practice is practiced. There is, across all of these figures and all of this writing, a quality of patience with imperfection that is among the most genuinely useful things the tradition offers. None of them describe the philosophical life as something they have achieved. All of them describe it as something they are in the process of attempting, with variable success, and all of them treat the variable success not as a reason to despair, but as evidence that the attempt is worth making. This is not lowered ambition. The ideal they hold is quite high. Virtue, full alignment between judgment and action, genuine equanimity in the face of every circumstance. But the relationship to falling short of that ideal is neither self-punishment nor resignation. It is the simple, steady decision to try again, because trying again is what is available, and because the trying, conducted with genuine care, is itself a form of the philosophical life, rather than a failure to reach it. Musonius Rufus exiled twice and returned twice, teaching in Rome and continuing to teach after everything the empire found to do in response to the teaching. He is, in the end, among the most quietly emblematic figures in the whole Stoic tradition, not because of the drama of the exile, which he would have been the first to set aside as belonging to the category of things that do not finally determine the quality of a life, but because of the returning to the city, the returning to the students, the returning to the small ordinary work of teaching people, one at a time. That philosophy is not a set of arguments held in the mind, but a set of choices made in the body, in the world, at the table, in the morning, in the 10,000 unremarkable moments that constitute, when added up and looked at honestly, the whole of what a life is. The philosophical life, on this account, does not announce itself. It does not require a particular setting, or a particular audience, or a particular level of external success. It requires only the daily return to the same discipline, the same quality of attention, the same willingness to examine what has just been judged, the same decision to bring conduct one small step closer to the ideal that has been held, imperfectly for years. Not because this makes a person great in any visible sense, but because the alternative, to live without this kind of attention, to let the hours pass without genuine inhabiting, to hold the philosophy as an ornament rather than a tool, is by every account these figures left behind simply a smaller life than the one that was available. The morning that Musonius Rufus described, simple, attended to, unremarkable in every external respect, is the same morning Marcus Aurelius was preparing himself for in the quiet of a military camp on the Danube, the same morning Seneca was writing toward, in letters he hoped would be useful to someone who cared about the hours he had left. The philosophy lives in that morning, not in the grand arguments, though the grand arguments are what gave the morning its shape. In the ordinary hour approached with ordinary care by an ordinary person who has decided, again today, to try to meet it well. Seneca was alone. The lamps had been trimmed low, the business of the day had concluded, and whatever noise the household made had settled into the particular quiet that comes only after the last interruption has passed, and nothing further is expected from the hours that remain. He sat and he reviewed. This is how he described the practice in his essays on anger, not as a punishment, not as a reckoning, but as something closer to the work a skilled craftsman does at the close of a long day, holding the finished piece to the light to see what holds and what does not in despair at the imperfection, but in the steady interest of someone who intends to return to the work tomorrow. What was done well, what fell short, where the mind moved cleanly and where it caught, where the voice rose when it need not have, where patience thinned before it should. Each item taken up, considered, and set down again, no sentence pronounced, no extended recrimination. The day passes before the mind the way a set of tools passes through an experienced hand, attended to, assessed, and returned to their place without drama. There is something in this practice that resists the word discipline. It does not ask for effort in the way that running in cold rain asks for effort. It asks only for willingness to be honest, and for the quality of attention that makes honesty possible, the readiness to look without flinching, and equally without the appetite for suffering that turns honest self-knowledge into something harsher than it needs to be. Seneca had been practicing this for years by the time he wrote about it, and the letters he sent to his friend Lucilius in those late years carry the tone of someone who has done this long enough that the practice itself has become a form of rest. The inquiry that once required deliberate effort has become something more like a familiar settling, the mind finding its own level at the end of the day, the way water finds its level, not because it is forced there, but because this is simply where it goes when the forcing stops. He was not the first to practice this. The Pythagoreans had used a similar review, and Seneca was careful to acknowledge it. 3 verses of Sextius that he kept and returned to, a guide for the mind at the edge of sleep. "Where did you go wrong today?" the lines asked. "What did you accomplish? What duty did you leave undone?" The questions are old, and their age is part of what makes them easy to settle into. By the time Seneca was writing, the practice had been refined across several centuries, and what arrived in his hands had the quality all well-used things eventually develop the fit of something shaped by many hands to a purpose it serves precisely. The review moves through the day in order, or nearly in order, an interaction that did not go well, a moment of impatience that was both felt and recognized too late, a task approached with less care than it deserved, a small generosity that cost nothing and was not given. These are not confessions, they are observations. The distinction matters because confession carries with it the expectation of absolution or punishment, and the Stoic Evening Review expects neither. It expects only that what is noticed honestly will leave a trace, not guilt, not self-condemnation, but something quieter and more durable than either, the kind of gentle calibration that does not announce itself, but appears, days later, in a response that arrives a little more cleanly than before, a patience that held a beat longer than it used to. Seneca returns to this instruction again and again across his letters. The examined life is not the tormented life. Philosophy is not a machine for producing suffering. It is a machine for producing clarity, and clarity, reliably and over time, produces something that sits closer to peace than the unexamined mind alternative. A man who does not look at his day does not escape its errors. He carries them forward, unexamined, into the next day and the one after, each small miscalibration compounding quietly until the distance between where he is and where he might be becomes too wide to easily cross. The Evening Review closes that distance gradually, one small correction at a time, without urgency and without drama, in the lamplight at the end of the day, when the tools have been put down and the night has begun to move in around the edges of the room. The practice does not stop there. The Stoics had another tool, colder in its first appearance, warmer in what it eventually produces. It begins with something loved, not an abstraction of love, but a particular thing, a friend whose company has been a steady presence, a morning that arrived clear and mild, a body that today performed its functions without complaint, a home that has been warm across the season. The mind holds the particular thing with attention, and then gently allows a second thought to arrive alongside it. This, too, is temporary. This particular friend will not always be here. This health, this warmth, this good morning will not persist indefinitely. Not as a threat, not as an alarm, only as the honest acknowledgement that nothing presented by the world arrives with a guarantee of duration, and that the mind which has forgotten this, as minds reliably do, given time and comfort, has also, without intending to, begun to grip. The Stoics called this practice, in its various forms, Negative visualization, though the name they gave it was less clinical than that translation suggests. What they were describing was the deliberate restoration of the mind's natural perspective, the view from outside the assumption of permanence that comfort produces. Not because permanence is bad, but because the belief in it is unstable. The mind that clings to what it has moves through the world in a permanent low-grade tension, braced against the loss it has not yet thought to prepare for, defending against a blow it has convinced itself will not come. This tension is mostly invisible until the moment the thing is actually threatened or taken, and then it becomes the only thing visible, enormous and destabilizing in proportion to exactly how thoroughly the mind had refused to admit the possibility. The practice loosens that grip, slowly and without force, by making the admission a regular and quiet event. On a given evening or in a pause of deliberate stillness during the day, the practitioner brings to mind something genuinely valued and holds alongside it the honest recognition of its contingency. The friend across the table, in whose company there is ease, this ease is not guaranteed, and the gratitude that this recognition produces, the slight brightening of attention it causes, is already something the grip had been preventing. The unheld hand does not clutch. The unheld hand can feel. This is what the Stoics were after. Not the detachment that suppresses warmth, but the attention that opens it. Not the cold removal of feeling, but the transformation of feeling, from anxiety to appreciation, from possession to presence. Epictetus made the point plainly in his own language. Say to yourself, when you look at your child, when you embrace your wife, these are people I love, and they are mortal. When a cup is shattered, you say, it was a cup, it was made to break. Hold the same thought about everything you love, and you will not be crushed when it breaks. You will have been, throughout the time you had it, more truly present to it than the mind that grips is ever able to be. There is a companion practice, and it moves in the same direction, but from a different angle. Where negative visualization begins with love and admits its contingency, premeditatio malorum begins with the possible difficulty and moves through it in advance calmly, the way a thoughtful traveler studies the terrain before setting out rather than discovering it, unprepared on the road. The premeditation of adversity, the deliberate, unhurried walk through a plausible difficulty, a frustration that might arrive tomorrow, a plan that might not hold, an effort that might meet resistance, taken not with dread, but with the prepared attention of someone who has thought through the route and knows where the difficult passages are. Marcus Aurelius returned to this practice throughout his years on the Danube frontier. In his private journal, in the Greek he chose deliberately for this private purpose, he reminded himself again and again, begin the morning by anticipating the difficult people, the complications, the frustrations, the minor and major failures of things to go as hoped, not as a prediction, not as pessimism, as preparation. A mind that has already walked through the possible difficulty with calm attention is not ambushed by it when it arrives. It enters familiar terrain. The ground has been covered, the response has been considered, and when the moment actually comes, there is a quality of recognition rather than shock. Ah, yes, here it is. I have been here before. The practice changes the texture of adversity itself. What arrives without preparation arrives into a mind at rest, which it then disrupts violently, requiring the mind to perform under its own disorder the recovery work that could have been done beforehand in stillness. What arrives into a mind that has already met it, even imaginatively, even briefly, arrives into a mind that has already found its footing, that has already asked and answered the primary questions What here is actually mine to respond to? What here is not? And what does responding well look like in this particular case? These are exactly the questions that panic prevents. Premeditatio malorum is the practice of asking them before panic has any occasion to arrive. Seneca recommended a variation of this practice that has a particular quality of testing. Set aside several days in a row. He suggested, not many, not indefinitely, a few days in a month, and in those days live without what is usually present. Simple food, not elaborate food, a hard bed, plain clothes, cold if available, not as punishment and not as performance of virtue for anyone else's benefit. As an honest question put to the body and to the mind without preemptive anxiety coloring the answer. The question is genuinely open. Is this as bad as the imagination insists? The imagination, it turns out, insists a great deal. The mind that has never been without its comforts has developed without noticing an entire internal architecture of assumed necessity. This warmth, which is comfortable, has become necessary. This particular food, which is enjoyed, has become something whose absence would be a deprivation rather than a neutrality. The imagination populates the future discomfort with suffering it has never actually tested, and then the practice arrives, and the simple meal is eaten, and it is not pleasant in the way the elaborate meal is pleasant, but it is not suffering either. The body performs its functions, the mind remains present, the evening passes. What this produces is not the contempt for comfort that Seneca was sometimes accused of recommending. He liked a good evening, a warm room, friends worth talking to. What it produces is the knowledge, carried now in the body rather than merely accepted in the abstract, that the ordinary adversities of ordinary life are genuinely manageable. Not as a consolation, not as the lesson of someone who has never had it good, but as an empirically established fact, confirmed by personal experience. This is what the practice was designed to find out, and most of those who tried it arrived at the same answer. The fear was larger than the thing feared. The anticipation of loss was more destabilizing than the loss itself proved to be. Chrysippus, working a generation after Zeno to systematize the philosophical structure the school had begun to build, arrived at an argument that gives these practices their deepest grounding. Emotions, he argued, are not simply things that happen to the mind, the way weather happens to a body standing in an open field. They are judgments. Fear is not a physiological event with a philosophical interpretation attached. Fear is itself a judgment, the judgment that something genuinely bad, something genuinely threatening to what is good, is approaching. Grief is the judgment that something genuinely valuable has been lost. Desire is the judgment that something not yet possessed would constitute a genuine good if obtained. What follows from this is not that the emotions are unreal or unimportant. It is that they are in principle available to reason in a way that weather is not. If fear is a judgment, and if the judgment is mistaken, if the thing feared is not genuinely bad, in the way the Stoics define genuinely bad, if it is a loss of money or status or comfort rather than a loss of virtue, which is the only genuine loss, then the fear can, over time and with practice, be corrected, not suppressed, not denied, corrected, the way a wrong sum is corrected, not by refusing to do arithmetic, but by doing it more carefully. This is what all the Stoic practices are working toward, in different ways and from different angles. The evening review is arithmetic done carefully on the day just past. Negative visualization is arithmetic done carefully on what is present and valued. Premeditatio malorum is arithmetic done carefully on what may arrive. Voluntary discomfort is arithmetic done carefully on what the body and mind actually need versus what habit has told them they need. None of these practices asks the practitioner to stop feeling. They ask the practitioner to examine what the feeling is reporting, because the feeling is reporting something, a judgment, an assessment, an evaluation, and that assessment may or may not be accurate, and accuracy is something the careful mind can move toward. The Stoics used a word for this sustained inner attention, proso. Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher who spent years reading and teaching the ancient traditions, identified this quality of attention to oneself, attention to the present moment of one's own inner life, as the foundational practice of Stoic philosophy, the one from which all the others flow and to which all of them return. The word carries a quality of watchfulness, but not the anxious watchfulness of someone expecting to be wrong, more the calm watchfulness of someone genuinely interested in what is happening, who would like to see it clearly before deciding what to make of it. Proso, as Hadot understood it, is not occasional. It is not reserved for the formal practices of the evening, the review, the visualization. It is continuous. It is the quality of mind that the Stoics were attempting to cultivate in every hour, the readiness to notice an impression as it arrives, the small flare of irritation, the quiet movement of worry, the sudden pull of desire, before it has been accepted, before the mind has given it the authority of a fact, before, in the Stoic language, the practitioner has given his assent, because this is the key mechanical insight that the entire tradition depends on. Between the arrival of an impression and its acceptance as true, there is a moment, brief, sometimes nearly imperceptible, but present, in which the mind has not yet decided. The impression arrives. This insult was real. This loss was devastating. This embarrassment was total. And in the moment before assent, the Stoic practitioner has the option, the one they spend years cultivating the awareness to use, of withholding agreement, not denying the event, not suppressing the response, simply not yet saying yes. This impression accurately describes what has occurred and what it means. Prosochi is the practice of keeping that moment available, of staying, through sustained and gentle attentiveness, at the threshold between impression and assent, so that the mind can pass through the day, not dragged by every impression that presents itself as urgent, but choosing, with some degree of deliberateness, which ones deserve to be taken as true. This is the practice at the end of the day, not the grand formal review, not the structured visualization, but this simpler and more continuous thing, the mind turned gently inward, watching the day's residue as it settles. The impression that returned 3 times, each time carrying a slight charge of agitation, though by the 3rd time the event itself was hours past. The judgment that sharpened in the early afternoon and left a trace, a faint argumentative quality, to the internal weather that persisted into the evening without an obvious object. The worry that arrived mid-morning as a reasonable practical concern and stayed beyond its mandate, growing gradually into something larger than the problem that had generated it. None of these are examined with urgency. Prosochi at this hour does not press, it does not interrogate. It watches with the kind of patient attention that a clear-eyed person brings to something interesting, not surprised by what it finds, not disturbed by the ordinary disorder of a day well lived, not requiring the inner weather to have been more settled than it was. The day had the weather it had. The question is not why was the weather like this, but what was the mind doing in it, and was that response the response of someone acting from the rational core, from the hegemonicon, the ruling faculty, the seat of judgment and choice, or was it the response of a mind pulled about by what it encountered, without having paused to consult its own best thinking. Seneca sat with this at the end of his evenings. He was not, by his own account, always satisfied with what the review produced. There were days that went well, and days that did not, and the honest inventory was not always flattering, but the practice was not designed for flattery. It was designed for knowledge, and knowledge, even uncomfortable knowledge, especially uncomfortable knowledge, has the quality the Stoics associated with all genuine goods. It does not change its value with circumstances. A true account of a bad day is worth more than a false account of a good one. The mind that can hold an accurate picture of its own performance, calmly and without the distortions of either self-congratulation or self-punishment, is already closer to the Stoic ideal than the mind that turns away. What Seneca also knew, and the letters make this clear, is that the practice changes the days that follow it, not through any mystical mechanism, through the ordinary operation of attention. What is consistently noticed is consistently available. A practitioner who has spent years conducting the evening review of his own responses to insult will find, after enough years, that the response to insult arrives with slightly more room in it, slightly more of the pause that the whole tradition depends on, the moment before assent, the instant of choice. The practice trains the very thing it requires. The attention required for the review becomes, over time, the quality of mind that makes the review easier to perform, and the situations reviewed more accurately perceived when they are actually occurring. These practices are not, in the end, about performing virtue before an audience, even an internal one. Musonius Rufus, who taught Epictetus in Rome, and who was the most practically minded of the major Stoic figures, was insistent on this point. Philosophy is enacted in what is done, not in what is said or known. The Stoic, who can describe the discipline of assent with perfect precision, but whose own assent slides around unexamined beneath his theoretical knowledge, has not, in any meaningful sense, understood what the discipline of assent is. Understanding is not the prize. The prize is the change in the quality of a particular day, the change in how a particular morning is met. Musonius taught this at the level of the mundane. What does the philosopher eat? How does he sleep? What does he do with discomfort when it arrives in the ordinary forms? Discomfort takes the cold morning, the unpleasant errand, the company of someone whose manner is difficult. These are not trivial questions set alongside the important ones. These are the important ones because these are the actual terrain in which the philosophical life is either lived or not lived. The grand adversities, the exile, the imprisonment, the forced death that Seneca himself eventually faced. These test the same capacities as the difficult dinner guest, only at an intensity that leaves less room for error. The daily practices are the training for what cannot be rehearsed directly. And then there is the ordinary evening, the one without drama or philosophical emergency. The lamp turned low, the household settled, the day's inventory taken and set down, the mind returning to the thread of its own attention, moving back from the outer record of what happened into the inner question of what was chosen and how, and whether the choosing came from the place in the soul that knows what it is doing. The Stoics believed this place was always there. It did not go away during the difficult day. It did not diminish under pressure or disappear when circumstances became disordering. It was, in Epictetus's language, the one thing that was truly, categorically, irreducibly theirs, not the body, not the reputation, not the property, not the role, none of the things that fortune could reach and handle and remove without asking permission. Only this, the capacity to choose how to meet what arrives, the capacity in the still moment between impression and assent to hold something calmly and ask whether it is true. Epictetus lost most of what fortune offers. He had been property. He had been subject to a master's decisions about his body and his hours, and what he found in those circumstances, found so completely that it became the foundation of an entire school of thought that outlasted the empire that had owned him, was that none of those circumstances had reached the one thing he named as his, the choice of response, the quality of judgment, the freedom that lives in the pause before assent, which no one had managed to confiscate, not because no one had tried, but because it was not the kind of thing that can be confiscated. This is what proso guards and exercises, this is what the evening review cultivates and clarifies. This is what the structured practices of negative visualization and the premeditation of adversity are designed to keep available under pressure, the awareness that the inner capacity is still there, still operative, still waiting to be consulted, even when the outer circumstances have contracted to their narrowest. The evening is the natural hour for all of this, not because the evening has any special philosophical significance, but because it is the hour when the outer press of the day releases its hold, when the tasks complete or defer themselves until tomorrow, when the noise of engagement fades and the mind, unbidden, turns toward its own interior. The Stoics did not invent the evening. They simply paid careful attention to what the evening was already doing and chose to meet it deliberately rather than by accident. Seneca at his lamp, conducting the gentle survey of the hours just completed, the 3 questions he borrowed from Sextius, asked without urgency, answered without drama. What went well? What fell short? What might be met differently tomorrow? Not as a court, as a conversation the mind has with itself in the particular quiet that the end of the day provides, honest, unhurried, and in the end strangely restoring. The practices come to rest here, in this quality of attention, not in the formal exercise, not in the structured visualization, not in the deliberate discomfort or the careful premeditation, though all of these have their proper hour and their proper use. They rest here in the mind turned gently toward its own interior at the end of the day, watching what the day produced, not with the sharpness of judgment or the weight of verdict, but with the calm, patient interest of someone who has lived with the practice long enough to know that what is seen honestly, without distortion in either direction, has already done most of what honest seeing is able to do. The worry that returned too many times settles into a simpler shape when it is seen clearly. The agitation that had no proper object releases, when it is named and examined, some portion of its claim to urgency. The judgment that sharpened unnecessarily in the afternoon hours is recognized in the still of the evening as having been sharper than the situation required, and in the recognition there is already the beginning of its release. None of this requires effort in the sense of strain. It requires the willingness to look and the quality of attention that makes looking possible. The Stoic prosoche, the gentle watchfulness that is the oldest and most continuous of all the practices, the one from which the others flow and to which they all, at the end of the day, return. The lamp burns lower. The household is long quiet now. The review moves slowly, not because it is laborious, but because there is no urgency pressing it forward. Nothing the night requires that must be reached before sleep arrives. The mind takes the time the mind needs. It finds what it finds. It notes what it notes. It sets down what needs setting down, and holds lightly what is worth holding, and allows the distinction between these to arrive on its own without being forced. And then, when the review has done what it can do, and the impressions of the day have been met and assessed and released from their provisional grip on attention, there is what remains. Not silence exactly, not blankness, something closer to what the Stoics called tranquility, not the absence of thought, but the absence of agitation in the thoughts that come, the condition in which the mind can observe its own activity without being entirely identified with it. The state in which the pause before assent has become so habituated that the mind rests within it, even in its ordinary moving. Seneca knew this condition. He wrote about it in language that sounds, across the centuries, less like philosophical description and more like a simple report from a place he had actually been. The mind at rest is not the mind emptied. It is the mind no longer in argument with what is. The circumstances are what they are. The day produced what it produced. Tomorrow will arrive with its own inventory, and the inner resources that met today will be present to meet it. There is nothing in this moment at the end of the waking hours that requires anything further from the practitioner than this: the gentle inward attention, moving without urgency through what remains, the mind watching its own still surface, the way a hand might rest on a table. Present, unhurried, requiring nothing, complete, this quality of attention turned inward at the end of the day, watching without grasping, neither dismissing what it finds nor magnifying it, neither demanding that the day have been other than it was, nor claiming that it was better than honest seeing allows. This is already a form of rest. The body will follow, the breath will slow, the impressions will lose their edges. The thoughts that arrive will come less frequently and with less urgency, and the intervals between them will grow longer and quieter, and the watchfulness will ease by degrees into something that is still, in some attenuated sense, watchfulness, but softer now, more yielding, no longer holding the world at arm's length for examination, but simply present to the warmth of the breath and the weight of the body and the particular quality of the dark in this hour. After the review has concluded and the lamp is nearly out, and the mind, having done its patient, honest work, releases its hold on the day and returns, as it does every night, to the simple fact of being here. Marcus Aurelius stepped outside his tent. The Danube frontier at night was cold in a way that had nothing personal about it, a vast, indifferent cold that pressed in from the dark fields beyond the camp, from the black width of the river, from the enormous sky overhead that showed more stars than any city dweller in Rome would ever see. The fires of the encampment burned low. The sentries moved at their posts in the measured, almost dreamlike pace of men who have learned to stay awake by staying slow. And there, between the last firelight and the open dark, the Emperor of Rome stood for a moment with his head raised, not praying, not reviewing the day's tactical decisions, not composing the letters he would need to write by morning, only looking up, the way a person looks when the sky is large enough to make the looking itself feel like something. He was in the middle of a campaign that would last on and off for most of the remaining years of his life. There were supply problems and plague, and the particular grinding weight of a war conducted not for glory, but for the maintenance of a frontier no one truly wanted to maintain. He would go back inside and write. He would pass another set of sentences before his mind, quiet, private sentences in Greek, addressed to no one, or addressed to himself, which for Marcus Aurelius were very nearly the same thing. But first, this moment, the cold air, the river somewhere beyond the darkness, the stars distributed across the black with a kind of patient extravagance, as though the sky had always had more than enough and knew it. The philosophers he had inherited called what he was looking at by a specific name. Not sky, not vacuum, not the indifferent machinery of matter in motion. They called it the pneuma, the breath, the tension, the living rational warmth that threaded through everything visible and invisible, binding each separate thing to every other separate thing in a network of quiet, continuous correspondence. To stand beneath the stars in the Stoic frame was not to stand beneath a mechanism, it was to stand inside an organism. It was to breathe with something that breathed back. The Stoic school in Athens had begun, as most things in its tradition begin, with a concrete problem and a concrete person. But the cosmological argument those early philosophers built was not merely a background decoration for their ethics, it was the foundation. The claim that the cosmos was rational, that the logos, the fire-like ordering principle, ran through every stone and breath and thought, was not a poetic convenience. It was the argument's load-bearing wall. Because if the cosmos was rational, and if the human mind was itself a portion of that same rationality, then the human being who lived according to reason was not imposing an alien discipline on a hostile universe. That person was moving with the grain of everything that existed. The calm they cultivated was not a retreat from the world, it was a return to it, to the real world, the rational world, the world as it actually was beneath the disordered surface of daily impression and fear. Marcus Aurelius had thought about this for years. The meditations that accumulated in his private journals during these frontier campaigns returned to the cosmological frame again and again, not because he doubted it, but because the contemplation of it was itself a practice, something he needed to revisit, the way the body needs to revisit breath, not once, but continuously, in the ordinary rhythm of a life that kept presenting him with reasons to forget it. The camp would wake in a few hours. There would be reports and decisions and the specific kind of loneliness that belongs to authority. But for now, the sky and the cold and the sense, which Stoic philosophy had made precise and available, that the darkness overhead was not empty, but inhabited by the same principle that inhabited his own chest, rational and patient and continuous. The Stoics called this sympathia. The word pointed at something more than sympathy in the ordinary sense. It named a physical doctrine, a claim about the actual constitution of the cosmos, not about human feelings or ethical preferences. In the Stoic account, the cosmos was a single living body, and every part of it was in contact with every other part, through the pneuma that pervaded it, the way warmth pervades a healthy body, not concentrated here or absent there, but distributed through the whole, holding the whole together, making the whole responsive to itself. What happened in one part of the body moved through the rest. Not instantly, not obviously, but actually, the way a change in temperature moves through water, the way sound moves through a room, even after the source has gone silent. The practical implication was unusual. A philosophy that began with the sovereign individual will, with the radical claim that the only thing genuinely in one's power is the quality of one's own judgments and choices, arrived by way of cosmology at the dissolution of the isolated self. The practitioner, who had spent years attending to the inner citadel, learning to distinguish what was within reach from what was not, learning to withdraw assent from destabilizing impressions, learning to meet what arrived with equanimity rather than panic. That practitioner, looking at the stars from the edge of a military camp, was not looking at something separate from themselves. They were looking at the larger body of which they were a part. The inner citadel was real. The sovereign will was real. and both of them were expressions of the same logos that held the stars in their arrangements overhead and the river in its course beyond the dark. Chrysippus had made the argument in its most rigorous form. He was the third head of the Stoic school and the philosopher most responsible for its systematic architecture, a man who reportedly wrote more than 700 treatises, almost none of which survive in complete form, leaving later scholars to piece together his arguments from fragments and references preserved in other people's criticisms of him. What survives in outline includes the doctrine that Chrysippus called ekpyrosis, the periodic conflagration. In the cosmological picture he inherited and developed, the universe was not permanent in its present form. At vast intervals of time, the entire cosmos would return to the primal divine fire from which it had come, not annihilation, but dissolution into the source, the way a wave returns to the ocean that formed it. And then, from that fire, the cosmos would regenerate, not randomly, not differently, but according to the same rational logos that had produced the first arrangement, yielding the same stars and the same earth, and in a sense that was not quite metaphorical, the same people and the same conversations and the same philosophical arguments, played out again in the identical form. This is a strange doctrine, and it was not universally accepted even within the Stoic tradition. Later Stoics, particularly those of the Roman period, are less concerned with it than with the ethical and psychological arguments at the tradition's center. But the ekpyrosis survives in the philosophical record as an image, and the image carries something worth holding, the sense that no single instance of the cosmos is its final form, that every arrangement of matter and thought and care is both utterly transient and somehow woven into the rational fabric of a universe that will return to it, that the passing of things is not the abolition of things, but their return to the fire that always preceded them. Marcus Aurelius thought about this in a different register, quieter and more personal. In the Meditations he writes not about cosmic cycles, but about history, about the great figures whose names Rome still spoke, with a particular reverence, the generals and emperors and philosophers whose lives had seemed to them and to their contemporaries to be the center of the world. Alexander the Great, he noted, had conquered vast territories, had wept when he believed there were no more worlds to conquer, and then had died and been buried, and the centuries had passed over him as they pass over everything. Julius Caesar, whose name had become a title, who had changed the political constitution of the ancient world, dissolved, as all matter is dissolved, into the same atoms that formed everything else, cycling through the universe in whatever new arrangements the logos required. These were not figures of disgrace, they were figures of proportion. Marcus Aurelius thought about them not to diminish them, but to locate himself correctly in the same sequence, another individual, another arrangement of matter and attention and care, lasting for a particular span of time before returning to the whole. The tone in which he holds these thoughts is not despair. It is something much more precise than despair, and much more useful. The best word for it might be proportion. The emperor who commanded the largest military force in the known world, who held the lives of tens of millions of people within the structure of his decisions, who was accorded the kind of power that most human beings in most of human history could not have conceived. This man found it steadying, not diminishing, to remember that Alexander also died, that Caesar also dissolved, that the stars above the Danube camp were there before Rome and would be there after it. Because the reminder did not ask him to care less, it asked him to hold what he cared about in its actual scale. The campaign mattered, the decisions mattered, the letter he would write in the morning mattered, and they mattered within a frame so large that their mattering could be felt without panic, acted upon without the kind of desperate grip that turns caring into suffering. Epictetus had framed the same recognition differently. He was not an emperor. He had been, before his freedom, property, a slave in Rome under a master named Epaphroditus, in a condition of material powerlessness, so complete that the philosophical question of what is within one's power must have felt like more than an intellectual puzzle. The answer Epictetus gave and taught and returned to in every surviving record of his school in Nicopolis was not a consolation prize for those who could not have more. It was a precise account of what freedom actually means and where it actually lives. Freedom is not the capacity to change circumstances. Freedom is the capacity to respond to circumstances from within a center that circumstances cannot reach. The image he used was a cart and a dog. The cart is moving. The metaphor stands for fate, for the Stoic doctrine of hymarmene, the rational necessity according to which every event unfolds exactly as the logos requires. The dog is attached to the cart by a rope. The cart will move regardless of what the dog does. The rope will hold regardless of what the dog does. Given these facts, the only question is whether this particular creature will run with the momentum of the moving cart, matching its pace, covering the same ground with something like dignity and ease, or resist, dig in, be dragged, cover the same ground in pain and confusion, and arrive at the same destination with its dignity abraded and its body exhausted. The ground covered is identical. The destination is identical. The difference is entirely in how the journey is made, and that difference, Epictetus insisted, is everything. It is the only difference that matters. It is, in the end, the definition of freedom. The Stoics were determinists. They believed and argued with considerable logical care that every event in the cosmos unfolds necessarily, that the logos which permeates and orders everything does not leave gaps for random deviation or uncaused choice, that what happens is what the rational order of things requires to happen. This might seem at first like a devastating position for a philosophy devoted to the cultivation of virtue and the exercise of disciplined choice. If everything is determined, what is the force of choosing well? What is the content of the Stoic insistence that the inner life is within one's power, if the inner life itself is woven into the same necessitated fabric as everything else? The answer the Stoics gave was that the rationality of the cosmos and the rationality of the human mind are the same rationality. That when a person reasons carefully, weighs impressions honestly, withholds assent from distorted thoughts, and chooses to act in accordance with virtue, they are not acting against the logos, but expressing it, participating in it, being what they are most deeply constituted to be. The freedom Epictetus described was not freedom from the cosmic order. It was freedom through alignment with it. The dog that runs with the cart is not surrendering. It is doing the thing that its nature, at its best, equips it to do, and in doing that thing, it is more fully itself than at any other moment. This is what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote, in the private vocabulary of his journals, about amor fati, though it was Nietzsche who would give the phrase its famous currency many centuries later. The love of fate, in the Stoic frame, is not resignation. It is not the passive acceptance of someone who has given up on changing anything. It is something closer to what happens when a person who has long been fighting the current of a river finally stops fighting and feels for the first time how strong and how certain the current is, and allows it to carry them, and finds in that carrying not helplessness, but something that feels, surprisingly, like rest. The individual self in this frame is brief. Marcus Aurelius knew this and wrote about it plainly, without drama, with the slightly tired equanimity of a man who has thought about it enough times that the thought no longer has sharp edges. The arrangement of matter and attention that constituted Marcus Aurelius would last for a particular span of years, and would then dissolve, its matter cycling on into other forms, its rational portion returning to the logos, from which in the Stoic account it had always been an expression. This was not exceptional. This was the condition of everything that existed. Every stone, every breath, every thought was subject to the same return. The stars visible above the Danube camp had existed before the Roman Empire and would outlast it. The river had been running its course through that landscape for longer than any human record reached, and would continue to run it after every name currently attached to its banks had been forgotten. And yet Marcus Aurelius did not write about this as though it were cause for grief. The dissolution of the self into the logos that produced it does not look, in the Meditations, like extinction. It looks more like homecoming. The individual flame goes out, but the fire of which it was a part continues, the fire that the early Stoics called the rational principle of everything, the warm, pervasive, ordering intelligence that held the cosmos together and expressed itself in every act of genuine reason and every moment of genuine virtue. To return to that fire was not to cease. It was to belong, more completely than the individual life permitted, to what the Stoics believed was the truest and most comprehensive nature of things. There is a passage in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius contemplates the generations before him with a kind of sustained, unhurried attention, not rushing to a conclusion, but dwelling patiently in the scale of it. The court physicians of former emperors, the astrologers, the brilliant advisors who had made themselves indispensable to powerful men, the people who had mourned them, all gone, not obliterated, but returned, their matter redistributed, their rational portion back in the larger fire, and his own position, looking backward at all of them, will one day be the same. Someone will look back at Marcus Aurelius the way he looks back at the court physicians of Hadrian, and then someone will look back at that person, and the sequence stretches in both directions beyond the reach of imagination. What survives is not the names. What survives is the logos threading through each arrangement of matter and concern, rational and patient and continuous. The Stoic account of the good life, expressed most precisely by Chrysippus as living according to nature, meaning simultaneously according to universal nature and according to one's own rational nature, arrives, at its full extension, at something that feels less like a doctrine than like a description of what is already true. The person who has internalized this argument does not need to work to achieve alignment with the logos. They need to stop working against it. They need to stop mistaking their preferences for necessities, their fears for certainties, their temporary arrangements for permanent ones. The good life in the Stoic account is available in every moment, not because every moment is pleasant or easy, but because every moment is real, and reality is rational, and the rational mind is already, in its best and most attended moments, a participant in the order that holds everything together. The pneuma that the Stoics described, this breath of the logos, this tension and warmth distributed through the entire living body of the cosmos, was not visible. It was not measurable by any instrument the ancient world possessed. What it named was a sense arrived at through argument and sustained by practice, that the apparent separateness of things is not their deepest truth, that the gaps between objects and persons and moments are traversed by something continuous, that the stillness felt at the end of a long day of genuine attention and honest choice is not the stillness of isolation, but the stillness of contact with the rational order that the Stoics believed was not merely a human aspiration, but the actual constitution of the cosmos they inhabited. Marcus Aurelius stood outside his tent for a while longer. The cold did not relent. The stars did not perform anything for him. The camp was quiet in the way that large groups of tired people are quiet. 1,000 small sounds folded into something that read, from a distance, as silence. Then he went back inside and sat down and wrote. What he wrote that night is not preserved separately from the rest of the meditations. The journal was not dated in any way that allows reconstruction, but the texture of what the meditations are is present in every line. A man measuring himself against what he believed was the rational order of things, finding himself sometimes adequate, sometimes not, returning without self-pity or self-congratulation to the only question that seemed night after night on this cold frontier, worth asking whether, in this particular day, with its particular pressures and failures and moments of unanticipated grace, he had remembered what actually mattered. Not power, not legacy, not the esteem of those who watched the emperor and formed their judgments. Whether the ruling faculty, the hegemonicon, the lamp burning at the center, had stayed clear. Whether the judgments had been honest, whether the choices had been expressions of logos rather than reflexes of fear. This is what the Stoic tradition built, across the centuries from Zeno's colonnade to Marcus Aurelius's campaign tent, not a system of comforting beliefs, not a technique for managing unhappiness, not a philosophy that promised the practitioner anything the world could not deliver. What it built was a frame, a way of standing inside a life, so that the life viewed from that position held its shape. The inner citadel that Marcus Aurelius returned to in the Meditations was not a refuge from the world. It was the place from which the world could be seen clearly, seen in its actual scale, its actual duration, its actual relationship to the rational principle that the Stoics believed ran through it like warmth through a living body. The summum bonum, the highest good, as the Stoics expressed it, living according to nature, according to logos, according to the rational harmony between the individual soul and the cosmic whole, was not a distant achievement reserved for the exceptional few. Chrysippus had made this explicit. Zeno had implied it from the beginning when he chose to teach not in a private garden, but in a public colonnade, open to whoever passed and was willing to pause. The philosophical life, in its fullest Stoic sense, was available to the slave who could not change his material condition, and the emperor who could change almost anything, because what it required was not circumstances of a particular kind, but attention of a particular quality, present, clear, unhurried, honest about what was within reach and what was not, patient with the gap between the ideal and the actual, while continuing, without drama, to close it. The cosmological frame made this not merely more comforting, but more precise. The individual who understood sympathia, the mutual responsiveness of every part of the rational cosmos to every other part, was not required to experience their small concerns as unimportant. The concerns were real, the choices were real, the suffering was real, but real inside a frame of such vastness, such continuity, such patient rational order, that the urgency drained out of things, the grip loosened, and what remained was not nothing, but something more like clear sight, the capacity to see the day's events for what they were, to respond from a center that was not merely personal, but participated in the logos that had been threading through every moment of this universe since before any human record reached. The stars Marcus Aurelius looked at from the camp on the Danube were made, in the Stoic account, of the same substance as the thoughts he was thinking. not metaphorically. The logos was the rational principle of the fire that constituted everything, stars and stones, and the interior activity of a careful mind. When he turned from the sky to the private page, he was not turning from the large to the small, from the cosmic to the merely personal. He was attending to one region of the same continuous rational fabric, the region most immediately within his reach, the only region where a human being could actually act, and therefore the region that Stoic philosophy insisted, again and again, was the one worth attending to with full seriousness and full care. The nights of those campaigns were long. The work was hard in ways that philosophy could articulate, but not remove. The losses, and there were losses, the plague alone had taken hundreds of thousands across the empire, were real losses, not merely philosophical problems. The Stoic tradition did not promise that the frame it offered would make pain unfelt or grief absent. It offered something different, the recognition that pain and grief, encountered without false addition, without the extra suffering of believing that what had arrived should not have arrived, or that the world owed a different arrangement, could be met with a steadiness that left the person more whole than before. The rational mind that had done the work of honest attention, that had practiced the discipline of assent and withdrawal and honest self-examination through the long ordinary evenings of a life, found itself, when the hard thing arrived, already partially prepared, not immune, not indifferent, but prepared, the way ground that has been cultivated for a long time receives the difficult season with more resilience than ground that has never been attended to. Seneca had written about this from a different angle, in the letters he composed in the last years of his life under Nero's reign, letters addressed to his friend Lucilius, but carrying in their urgency and precision the quality of a man writing for himself as much as for anyone else. What Seneca returned to again and again across those 124 surviving letters was the question of time, not time as cosmological duration, not time as the medium of historical change, but time as the material of a single human life, and the question of what that life was spent on. He argued that most human beings gave their hours away to distraction, to ambition, to the management of fears that would never materialize, and desires that would never satisfy, and arrived at the end of their lives having spent enormously without having lived at all. The philosophical life was not the life free from difficulty. It was the life in which the hours were inhabited, actually inhabited, rather than passed through on the way to something that never quite arrived. This is why the evening practice mattered, the nightly sitting with the day's events, passing each hour before a careful, unhurried interior attention, asking not what had gone well or badly in the world's terms, but what had been done with the freedom that each hour contained. Seneca described this practice with the calm of someone who had actually done it, not as an aspirational recommendation, but as a description of a thing that worked, that repaid the attention given to it, that made the morning different by making the evening honest. The camps on the Danube had evenings too. Somewhere beyond the military documentation, somewhere in the private activity of a man who read philosophy as a practice rather than a subject, Marcus Aurelius sat with his lamp and his Greek sentences and did the same thing, returning to the day, not to judge it, but to see it, clearly and without addition, the way the Logos itself, in the Stoic account, saw everything, rationally, continuously, without preference for one arrangement over another, but always attending to what was actually there, the cosmos breathing, the individual flame burning briefly and clearly within the larger fire. every choice a small expression of the rationality that held the stars in their courses, every honest thought a participation in the logos that had been threading through the universe since before any of this existed and would continue threading through it after all of this had returned to the source. The night deepened over the Danube. The fires in the camp burned lower,